The Paul K. Longmore Institute on Disability at San Francisco State University presents the 2022 Longmore Lecture in Disability Studies, Disability and Philanthropy, from the Telethons of the Past to Disability Justice Today, taking place on Thursday, March 10th, 2022, from 4 to 5:30 Pacific, featuring Sandy Ho, Ryan Easterly, and Bridgit Antoinette Evans.
Hello, everyone. My name is Emily Badix, and I am the Associate Director at the Longmore Institute on Disability. Just a couple of access notes, and then we'll get our program started. We've provided the stream text link in the chat, and we encourage you to use that if you prefer a more personalized option for captions. We also have turned off chat today to make this a more accessible program, but we really still want some of that community dialogue. So please use the Q&A feature as if it's a chat. You can start now by sharing where you're joining us from, so we know who all is here today. And yeah, please ask questions in that space too. We will have time for Q&A later. With that, I will pass it to Director of the Longmore Institute, Kathy Kudlick. Thank you, Kathy.
Hey, hi everybody, and thanks for joining us today for Disability Philanthropy, from the Telethons of the Past to Disability Justice Today. And as Emily said, I'm Catherine Kudlick, and I'm Professor of History and Director of the Paul K. Longmore Institute on Disability at San Francisco State, where we basically strive to create a world where everyone believes that society is better because of disabled people. I also oversaw completion of Paul Longmore's epic history of telethons that some of you might know. I'm a white woman with short silver hair and cool red glasses with long red earrings. And I'm speaking to you from where I live on occupied land of the Ohlone people, and invite each of you joining us today to reflect upon where you are and the cost of being here. For the 2022 Longmore Lecture in Disability Studies, we're diving deep into a topic near and dear to lots of our hearts: disability and philanthropy. Before going too deep, though, I invite you to take a moment to reflect on the first images that come into your head when you put the words disability and philanthropy together. And go with your gut here. Where do you imagine? Who do you imagine? And what are they doing? I'm guessing that many of us went to that dark place of telethons from the 1960s through the 2000s, the early 2000s, where Jerry Lewis paraded pathetic, helpless cripples, I say with some quotation and irony here, children in front of TV cameras to raise money for the Muscular Dystrophy Association, or the MDA. And watching these programs, scholar activist Paul Longmore saw visions of himself everywhere, including on the canisters collecting coins at fast food restaurants. And this prompted young Paul to wrap his arm around one and tell the bewildered cashier, should I take the money now, or should I just wait for them to send it to me? Jerry Lewis's iconic telethons lasted for about a half century, 50 full years, and raised a hefty sum that on some levels did some good. Jerry's kids got badly needed mobility and medical equipment. And sorry, my screen just went blank. That's interesting. So Jerry Lewis, they did these, fundraising efforts, and Jerry Lewis's telethons raised money for kids to go to camp. It raised medical equipment, and they could attend these accessible summer camps where they could bond with other kids with disabilities. It was one of the few opportunities where they got to do this. But as historian Paul Longmore showed in his path-breaking book, Telethons, Spectacle, Disability, and the Business of Charity, this came at a huge cost for individuals and for society as a whole. For over 50 years, these pathetic images designed to open donors' wallets were the only impression most Americans had of disability and disabled people. And basically, without the voices of people with disabilities, or without internet or alternative views, The Labor Day weekend-long entertainment extravaganzas were like this fire hose of bad publicity, just on and on and on. And those of us in disability activist circles still work to cure this tragic case of social, ideological, and political brainwashing. Now, by casting people with disabilities as individuals who are passive victims of tragedy, telethons created a dynamic where we were only understood as people who needed help, help that could only come from kind-hearted, non-disabled people. And we were takers, we were never givers. And as such, history basically passed us by, and it ignored a proud list of amazing accomplishments and contributions by people with disabilities. Today's panel shows how disability philanthropists are flipping that script in exciting and transformational ways. Replacing the telethon-inspired association between disability and philanthropy opens the door for imagining disabled people as people with something to offer one another and to society as a whole, as people that are part of innovative solutions rather than problems to be fixed. And this new conception of philanthropy foregrounds disability justice principles of interdependence and leadership by those most impacted, while also loosening this ferocious grip of capitalism. Now, while some of philanthropy's negative portrayals that Paul Longmore studied for telethons would be familiar, having disabled people serving as program officers and executive directors of philanthropic organizations would have blown his mind. And so this panel is a wonderful tribute to Paul, who would be beaming at the idea of what disabled people can make possible when our voices and expertise take center stage. So without further ado, let me turn to Sandy Ho, who will set up our discussion with some introductory remarks and then moderate the panel with Ryan and Bridgit. And for those of you who don't know Sandy, she's a visionary disabled community organizer with a long-standing commitment to grassroots disability activism and advocacy. And she's the founder and co-organizer of Disability Intersectionality Summit, a biennial national conference that basically uplifts and celebrates the lived experiences of disabled people of color. In addition, Sandy's the program director of the Disability Inclusion Fund of the Borealis Philanthropy. Thanks so much for helping make this conversation possible, Sandy, and take it away.
Thank you so much for that introduction, Kathy. Hello, everybody. I'd like to begin by providing an image description of myself. I am an Asian American queer disabled woman with short, dark, wavy hair. I'm wearing rainbow frame glasses. I'm also wearing a dark blue button-up shirt with a white floral pattern, and I have on a pink blazer. On the lapel of the blazer is a pin that's in the shape of the Star Trek communicator badge. And the reason why I'm wearing it is because one of the things that I most recently learned about Paul Longmore, and one of the favorite things that I've learned about him is that he was also a Star Trek fan, as am I. And so I figured that this would be an appropriate occasion to wear this in. My background is blurred, and I'm zooming to you all from the unceded lands of the Massachusetts people. So I was thrilled to be invited, and it is such an absolute privilege to be this year's Longmore lecturer. And later on in the program, I'm honored to be joined in conversation with two powerful and thoughtful leaders in philanthropy, Bridgit Antoinette Evans from Pop Culture Collaborative and Ryan Easterly from the With Foundation. Now, while I was thinking about how to structure our time together, I thought of Mia Mingus's words from her 2018 keynote at the Disability and Intersectionality Summit. And it was in her keynote where the phrase access is love, solidarity is love, and disability is justice is love came about. And in tonight's context, access is love means that our communities of disabled people, scholars and activists, dreamers, schemers, and resource mobilizers of social justice movements have gathered across time zones and Wi-Fi networks to be together. And this decision to hold the lecture online was made with love, and I'm sending a remote hug to the many disabled people who cannot or are not ready to attend gatherings in person in the face of over 950,000 deaths from the coronavirus in the US. And in this particular context, solidarity is love means lifting up the many disabled students from across university campuses who have mobilized to demand accessible learning opportunities. And in particular, I want to recognize the Disabled Student Union at UCLA for successfully leading a coalition of student groups in a 16-day sit-in, the longest in the university's history, for a more equitable and safe learning environment. Disability Justice is Love shows us how the incredible legacy of Paul Longmore's scholar activism can offer ways to move all of us, including philanthropy, just a little bit closer towards collective liberation from ableism in our present and future. And I'm so excited to explore this further in today's lecture and discussion. So, Paul passed away in 2010, and unfortunately, I never had the chance to meet him. However, while reading his book, Telethon, Spectacle, Disability, and the Business of Charity, I found myself missing his voice and his presence. And as many of his students and his colleagues have noted, Paul's analysis had a way of immediately connecting with everyday experiences of disabled people with the broader systems of power, whether through public policies, narrative, culture, and history. And so it was while reading Paul's book that I began to revisit and reflect on some of my own experiences as a disabled person, particularly the ones that I kind of thought were just, run-of-the-mill life events. And so I'd like to share one of those reflections with all of you now. Okay. So on the screen right now is a family photo. There's my mom, my dad carrying me in a blue baby carrier on his back, and my older brother who is non-disabled. And in full Ho family style, my older brother and I are proudly wearing our Boston Red Sox hats. And we are all on the Great Wall of China. And in the background, you can see that there are crowds of people along its path over the mountains. This was taken sometime around 1990, the summer before I started kindergarten. And so I was about 4 or 5. My parents had taken us on our first trip to China. And while there, we learned about our culture. We met our great aunties and uncles and my great grandmother, who was still alive at the time and living in Nanning. And it was an incredible trip that, of course, my older brother and I probably didn't appreciate as much as we should have at the time. And so this sets the stage for what will appear on the next slide. Okay, so summer vacation is over. We returned, and my older brother started 5th grade, and I began kindergarten. We both went to the same public elementary school. And when it's time for school picture day, my mom is super excited to dress me up for my first school photo. And this moment for my mom, who was a refugee from Vietnam, who later emigrated to the US, it was about having proof. It was about having some visible evidence that our family had made it, that we were doing things everyone else in our suburb who had perfect families were also doing. So on this slide, we have 2 school photos side by side. And the one on the left is from kindergarten, and the one on the right is from 1st grade. The kindergarten photo, my mom had put me in this outfit that we had brought back with us from Quanming, a city in Yunnan province. And this outfit was something that was traditionally worn by children in the ancient villages of Quanming. So I'm wearing a white and red embroidered headband, and then a white long sleeve shirt. And over it, there's a red top that has embroidery detailing across the front. I'm smiling at the camera, and there's a gray blanket that's right behind me, which I will get to in a moment. And on the right, it's a year later, and I'm in first grade. I'm wearing a white long sleeve button-up shirt with a red vest that has polka dots on it and a collar that has a flower pattern. And in this photo, which really honestly can only be interpreted as the foreshadowing of the queer AF to come, let's be honest, it does not have a blanket in the background. And so the black seat and the handlebars of my wheelchair are visible, as I'm also smiling in this photo. Seared into my memory is the look of anger, defeat, and sadness when my mom pulled my school photo and my older brother's school photo that first year in kindergarten. Because instead of this being evidence that her family had made it, right, and instead of bragging to our relatives, gong gong po po, aunties and uncles numbers 3 through 9, this was instead a reminder that the world would not perceive her children the same way, no matter how much pride in our culture and identities that our parents instilled. And so this was 1990, right? So the year the Americans with Disabilities Act had been passed. 15 years before this, in 1975, what was originally known as the Education of Handicapped Children Act, and is now known as the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, IDEA, had already been in existence. And so all of these civil rights mean that I had the right to attend public school. I had hearing aids and an FM system that the school system was required to provide. I had the right to physical therapy and speech therapy. I also had the right to dream right alongside my non-disabled classmates. When Mrs. Keene, our kindergarten teacher, asked, "What do you want to be when you grow up?" However, I apparently did not have the right to be seen as a disabled kid in a wheelchair, or really to even think of myself in that way. So the school photo from first grade is proof that my mom made sure that this little blanket stunt would never happen again. And when I eventually found my way into CRIP community among disabled comrades, I came to understand that this covering of the wheelchair and this erasure of our disabled selves from school photos and in many other ways is actually a shared life moment for many of us, and brings a certain CRIP intimacy that we have with one another. Okay, that's great, Sandy. So at the risk of, inviting Paul Longmore's ghost to haunt me forever, because I just started a lecture on the legacy of telethons with photos of me as a disabled kid, what does any of that actually have to do with telethons, fundraising, and philanthropy? Well, when some of you saw that photo and heard the context that I shared, some of you may have had sympathetic or a similar emotional response, and that is to be expected. I don't remember who put the blanket over the back of my wheelchair in that first photo. And maybe it was my teacher, maybe it was the photographer, whoever it was, that person was driven by some kind of misplaced sympathy when they saw me. So in his book, Longmore describes sympathy as something that, and on the screen is the text that reads, "Sympathy does not simply emerge spontaneously and, as it were, organically. It is formed by and helps to form cultural values, social ideologies, and institutional structures that provide relief and succor." End quote. Charities, nonprofits, and other fundraising institutions tap directly into that influence of sympathy in their donor messaging and strategies in a variety of ways. And Longmore referred to this practice as the sympathy entrepreneurs. And their pitch to donors was then broadcast through telethons via mass media, and then later on, when the technology became available, through the internet. And so some of you, as Kathy had mentioned earlier, maybe remember these telethons. For some of you, maybe your families gathered around to watch and even donated, presumably thinking that you were supporting and bettering the lives of people with disabilities whose stories you heard. So these telethons were fundraisers, and they were often for the disability charities and direct services organizations, and a few who also funded medical research. So these organizations included Muscular Dystrophy Association, MDA, United Cerebral Palsy, UCP, March of Dimes, and what was known at the time, National Society for Crippled Children, before they eventually changed their name to Easter Seals. And so they would air through the night and through the holidays, such as Christmas or Labor Day weekend, and feature these headlining celebrities, right? Like the Jackson 5 and Frank Sinatra. And while the sympathy entrepreneur, the MC, would, and I quote, give you the information that will touch your heart, possibly tap a nerve end here and there. It'll certainly wrench you because these are the human beings that you can certainly identify with. And this was said by Jerry Lewis, who was considered the most successful sympathy entrepreneur. The first MDA broadcast was in 1966 and was the first of its kind of fundraising event to raise more than $1 million in pledges. And so from the 1950s until 2015, Jerry's Kids, as they were known, was the donor hook that raised over $2 billion with the goal of curing disability at best. But basically, they would often settle with the hope of eradicating the word disability from our future altogether. Telethons and their sympathy entrepreneurs did not fund disability. Instead, these dollars were raised to actualize what they would have preferred, which is to say, make this person with a disability on your television screen have no disability at all. And so this grotesque morphing and monetizing of sympathy to something that was about fundraising aimed to erase disability, to invalidate and reject disabled narratives and existence, and to deem disabled people as essentially human beings unworthy of having any kind of life outside of making a donor feel better about their charitable deed. This became the muscle memory that drove much of the funding machinery for disability and disabled people. And so traditional charity and charitable giving have been complicit in reinforcing this idea and way of perceiving disabled people time and time again. For over half a century, eugenics was the donor engagement strategy. And so as Paul Longmore demonstrated extensively in his book, telethons were the mechanism that sold this sob story donor hero fairy tale in a way that has seeped into every crevice, that has upheld every pillar, and is present in every sector of our public life, political ideologies, public health guidance. It has shaped American morals and values, and media representations of people with disabilities. So then, given the legacy that had already sunk its teeth into the fabric of American life by the time Sandy Ho in 1990 was ready for her kindergarten photo, right, it makes sense, and it is then unsurprising why my school photo at the time erased disability altogether. Seemingly, the script for my own narrative arc in relation to disability had already been written decades ago, and the roles had already been cast. But plot twist, because no one at school, including myself the next day, was ready for the absolute word lashing that my mother gave them. And so it is by rejecting that narrative over and over and over again, in that way that an Asian mom does, what my parents did was give me an understanding of bodily autonomy, of agency, of representation, of choice and pride in how I am represented. Did they always get it right? Absolutely not. And those are the conversations that I have with my friends and therapists. But they showed up, right? They got loud, sometimes to my embarrassment. And they were both insistent and consistent with their generous and unconditional love that has then set me up to lead a life of self-determination. So some of you right now are thinking, okay, Sandy, I think you're being a little bit too harsh because some of those dollars raised did good things for people with disabilities. I hear you. But for every good intention that happened, how many dollars were then raised to justify eugenics, cures, and ableism for another kid with a disability or disabled person? Disability justice is a framework and provides guiding principles that help move us closer to that collective liberation from ableism. Good intentions is what leads us to the fact that still today, many non-disabled people think it's better to be dead than disabled. Good intentions are about presumptions that rob power and agency. Good intentions will not move us closer to that future of collective liberation. And in fact, they tend to waste a lot of time by setting us back and requiring us to then correct course. Here's the thing. We already have over half a century's worth of good intentions to correct. So let's not waste more time. And so while it is a beginning, shifting the needle as fundraisers and funders in this sector to include more people with disabilities is ultimately not enough to obliterate the remnants of eugenics messaging that has been left for disabled people in the present, in the near future, and for disability communities who will continue to live long and prosper centuries from now. So thank you, Mr. Spock, for that. So, although I am new to this role as the director of the Disability Inclusion Fund at Borealis Philanthropy, I know that disabled people as philanthropists is not actually new. We often think of philanthropists as people who provide monetary resources, funding through grants, donations, and gifts. And I think that this framing is limiting to both funders and the movements that we support. And so rather, I think that we should reconsider the actual meaning of a philanthropist. So philanthropy comes from the Greek prefix phil, meaning love or fond of, and anthrop, meaning human being or humanity. And so a philanthropist is a lover of humanity, someone who promotes the quality of life, the well-being and welfare of humanity and people. Access is love, solidarity is love, disability justice is love. And today, when it can sometimes feel like we have completely uprooted ourselves far away from these origins, I want to offer a reminder that philanthropy is supposed to be about love of people. And so it is in this way that disabled people are actually some of the most radical, generous, and revolutionary philanthropists who have already been a part of philanthropy. So the radical work that needs to happen in this sector must be about moving beyond the inclusion of people with disabilities in philanthropy. let's take off that metaphorical gray blanket because our movement leaders already are philanthropists. Okay, so in what ways are disabled people philanthropists? Well, for this, I just turned to the disability justice movement. On the screen are the logos for the groups Disability Justice Culture Club and Fireweed Collective. Disabled people give abundantly to our communities and movements through mutual aid groups, such as these, and have already continued to be leading the way on. Disabled people are philanthropists in the ways that we also look after one another's well-being and care throughout this pandemic. And for that, we have to look no further than the hashtags No Body is Disposable, which has really elevated disabled voices to prioritize people with disabilities during multiple public health and environmental crises. Promoting quality of life and welfare can also be found in the hashtag Crip the Vote, which has shifted power to voices and perspectives of disabled people on important policy discussions. On the screen right now are the logos for Project Let's, Health Justice Commons, Generation Patient, Autistic Women and Non-Binary Network, and LNJ Empowerment. Our movement leaders, including the groups that I just named, have all been promoting the quality of life and well-being of disabled, CRIP, chronically ill, NAD, and neurodivergent body-minds. So all of the inventiveness and wisdom from disability communities is not new to disability justice. Rather, it's this philanthropic sector that has really only just begun to learn and is new to fully holding space for us. Disabled people are philanthropists because the resources, the CRIP hacks, and the wisdom that our communities and movements give are sustainable, are anti-ableist, and are also anti-eugenics. So at Borealis Philanthropy, which is where the Disability Inclusion Fund is housed, when we say that we are in trusted relationships with our movement leaders, we don't just hold that relationship at arm's length and then evaluate it like it's some kind of output from our programs or funding. And as fund leaders, our political homes include the movements that we came up in, whether it's from disability justice to trans and queer liberation to racial justice, and that we now get to support as funders. At the Disability Inclusion Fund, we welcome trust into our work as funders through participatory grant making. And for the Disability Inclusion Fund, a participatory grant making process means that disabled people, as the reviewers of applications, hold space with unconditional love for one another in order to have those really tough conversations, are then part of the decision-making process in the grant making. And so this participatory grant-making process is not easy. And since I've begun, I have observed more funders and foundations making the shift towards this way of doing. And so I hope that the mantra, "Nothing about us without us," which originated from South Africans with disabilities, can offer guidance for other funders' grant-making practices and purpose. So this is what I believe is really necessary for our sector to begin that slow and painstakingly careful, the diligent and thoughtful hard work to then root out the legacy of eugenics that had permeated every facet of our society in the present and future. But rooting out the harms is really only the first phase of the work. Because in my current role, I think often about the vestiges of telethon messaging that our disability movements continue to find ourselves mired in. For example, in pop culture, there's a constant overcoming disability messaging in movies, or in the reality TV shows that feature little people as spectacles to be gawked at. In public health, we only need to look at the ways that comorbidities have been weaponized against disabled and chronically ill lives, who we also know are more likely to be Black, Indigenous, and people of color. And in our public policies, disabled people still do not have access to marriage equality without the risk of losing access to Medicaid. And so we can trace all of these threads, lead us back to eugenics and pervasive ableism. But if we push further, which the sector can and must do, I believe in us, I would not be here otherwise. The Disability Inclusion Fund is also imagining and working towards a future where disability justice and disability rights movements are not just about upending what was there, but have the freedom to actualize collective liberation from ableism. And so to that point, and before I close, I just want to offer an imagining of collective liberation from ableism and the role that I think funders and the philanthropic sector can have. And in my envisioning, this would look like a time when all disabled philanthropists on the front lines of our movement and in the sector can focus their energies on organizing towards and building more joy. So my first week at Borealis Philanthropy, and thanks to the bold and incredible leadership of the Disability Inclusion Fund's program officer, shout out to Nikki Brown Booker, along with 6 grant-making advocates, had just completed its second grant cycle, which gave a total of $2.6 million to 34 grantee partners. And I think it was probably like my 3rd or 4th week that I began to have office hour meetings with a few of our new grantees, taking the time to introduce myself in this new role and getting to know their work. And I spent those office hours asking like 3 or 4 questions, but mostly I remained quiet and I listened hard. And one question that I asked every single organization that I met with was, can you tell me a little bit about how joy and care show up in your work or organization? So why did I ask this question? I asked it because I understand and know firsthand as a community organizer and as an activist, the stress of trying to communicate a vision and a goal that is not concrete and may not be supported by numbers and evidence or have the clear benchmark for evaluation, or that already comes neatly prepackaged in a plan that is mapped out in a chart of 3 to 5 phases. Because that's how I felt when I was envisioning the Disability and Intersectionality Summit and sharing that idea with funders. DIS, I explained, would be a national community conference organized solely by deaf and disabled activists, and then have a program of disabled people who also experience marginalization in a multitude of ways as the presenters who share their experiences, perspectives, and thoughts on topics that they decide is important. And at the time in 26, I had no idea whether it could be done. But I did know that DIS could be organized with care by centering disability justice principles at its core. And I knew in my bones that the excitement that it sparked in conversations with disabled comrades, that DIS was something that our movement could build upon and share. And so the question that I asked about joy and care in the work of our grantee partners comes from knowing about the risk it takes to share a dream, the risk of rejection, and also the risk of someone else investing in your dream. But as I have heard multiple times and have witnessed it firsthand myself, Borealis Philanthropy does things differently. And so through our 9 donor collaborative funds, we're helping to resource a world that we know is possible. And just like movement work, possibility is messy. And I believe being open to possibility must be the first step towards transformative change. And so when I asked that question, all of the groups I met with were immediately surprised. And they said, Sandy, we know that you're new here, but a funder never actually asked us that before, which to me immediately informed that this question needed to be asked more often. And there were a lot of moments of pause, right? And the responses that folks gave and that I heard led to deeper understanding, to moments of vulnerability and conversations that were real and frank, and that shifted from that place of need towards what would actually lift up and strengthen the work that was already being done. And so more than the other questions I asked, I think this question in particular brought our relationships closer in trust. So one of the principles of the disability justice framework is sustainability. And I quote from Sins Invalid: "We pace ourselves individually and collectively to be sustained long-term. Our embodied experiences guide us towards ongoing justice and liberation," end quote. To sustain our movements means we must hold space and capacity for joy and care. And funding in these areas with the same urgency as our sector does in times of crises. So I actually want to pause a moment, and this is just a heads up to our ASL interpreters that I am briefly moving away from the script. So I wrote this weeks ago. And in the unpredictable timing of the world that we live in, where a week feels like a month and a month feels like a year, let me be clear that I'm here tonight because I'm owning everything that I have said and that I'm about to say. But I'm not suggesting that in this moment where there is a war in Ukraine and don't say gay bills and anti-trans legislation, that there's not actual painful crises and need that is being held that is very real and painful for our movement leaders. But it is from, I think, a position of privilege to be able to name and choose priorities, right? To then also put resources behind those. And so what I am saying is that I believe to do right by the lived experiences and the powerful wisdom of our movement leaders who have carried all of us so far, it means that we can and must do both. So some of you who are listening from within philanthropy might already be familiar with this idea of trust-based philanthropy. These are the core values and intentional practices that shift power between funders and grantees in ways that aspire towards greater equity and mutual accountability in our relationships with movements. But I believe to fully live into the values of that framework, this sector must also show up and support our movement leaders and organizations in addition to the moments of crises and need. Funding joy and care further engenders trust between funders and the communities in ways that communicate to them that they already know what is best and are already leading on the effective strategies to solve some of our society's most pressing problems. So in the book Pleasure Activism, Adrienne Marie Brown, which I know many of you out there are familiar with, and I quote, "Recognize that pleasure is a measure of freedom," end quote. So building upon that, I consider joy to be this expansive category and as a practice that includes activities that are measurable, that are emotionally felt and visible. So this could look like innovative or new community-led strategies that lead to civil rights wins. It could look like boba happy hours as a team, which was one of the responses from a grantee that I got from my earlier question. Joy is also a powerful tool that also unites community members through creative and diverse politicized advocacy. And I'm reminded of the queer dance parties that happened in front of Stephen Miller's house in DC. Miller was the architect of a policy that had caged migrant children and removed them from their parents and families. So I also believe that giving unconditional love to what has already been prioritized and named as a goal by our movements, maybe, hashtag I'm still new and learning, just maybe might be a way that the philanthropic sector avoids past mistakes like movement capture. Movement capture is a concept and a framework that comes from Dr. Megan Ming Francis, who is an associate professor at the University of Washington. And this describes and is used to understand the harmful relationships between white donor dollars that completely rerouted the early priorities of the civil rights movement from opposing racial violence to them focusing on education. Funding joy and care means that this sector just might get out of its own way and instead lift up and make stronger the existing ingenuity and creativity from movement leaders that have already been tried, proven, and are celebrated. So those sympathy entrepreneurs, the MCs selling those sob stories, maybe they've gone away. But disabled people have been living, experiencing, and are still being harmed by someone else's scripted story for us. And so the start of joy and disability movements is about lifting up the existing and developing visions, narratives, and strategies from our disability justice leaders. Grant making towards and for unrestricted joy and disability justice means that we go finally beyond just talking about moving the needle on inclusion and disability, and then move towards actualizing the wild and fantastical movement-led dreaming and scheming. Funding joy is how we get to practice unconditional love, the same kind that my parents repeatedly showed me as a kid. It is loud, it is insistent and consistent, and it's how we can all better show up for our communities. So it is a certain Captain Picard of the USS Enterprise who once said, and I quote, "The past is written, but the future is left for us to write." And we have powerful tools, openness, optimism, and the spirit of curiosity, end quote. And this slide has a graphic of Captain Picard and the USS Enterprise. And yes, it was a lot of fun emailing to ask if it would be possible to use Star Trek font in a slide. 10 out of 10 would recommend. So the telethons, the sympathy entrepreneurs, and even grant making for the status quo, these are a part of our story. But they are not the story as we've chosen to write it. And so our future is collective joy. And I invite each of you, whether you are an academic, you're a student, you're an activist, researcher, donor, resource mobilizer, to help make it so. Thank you so much for listening. And at this point, I would love to invite Bridgit Antoinette Evans and Ryan Easterly to join me in a discussion. Both Bridgit and Ryan are two people who have far more experience than me in the sector. And we're also one of the first two people outside of Borealis Philanthropy to welcome me into this role as well, which meant a lot. So they have both, already contributed, moving us closer towards joy. Hi, Bridgit and Ryan.
Hello.
Hello.
So before we begin, and for accessibility purposes, I would like to invite both of you to please provide a visual description of yourselves and introduce yourself, as well as the organization, for folks who might not already be familiar.
Well, I'll jump in. I'm Bridgit Antoinette Evans. I'm a Black woman with an afro and bright, like bluish purple glasses. I'm wearing a striped indigo scarf around my neck and a black sweater, and I have gold hoop earrings. I spent most of my career as an artist and a culture change strategist. But about 5 years ago, I began a journey into institutional philanthropy as the CEO of the Pop Culture Collaborative, which is a philanthropic fund a learning community working to transform the narrative landscape around people of color, immigrants, refugees, Muslims, and Indigenous peoples, especially those who are women, queer, transgender, non-binary, and/or disabled. And we do that through by fostering collaborations between social justice movements and the entertainment, advertising, and media industries. And I would say, as a last kind of note about the organization, we have a North Star of equipping the pop culture for social change field to use story and cultural experience and narrative to build deep yearning, like a emotional hunger for the opportunity to play our role in co-creating a just and pluralist society, which we define as a community that is actively engaged in the hard and delicate work of belonging together. And I'm so glad to be here tonight. And Sandy, so your talk was just extraordinary, and I'm really glad to be working alongside you.
Hi, everyone. My name is Ryan Easterly. My pronouns are he and him. As a visual description, I'm a Black identifying man with Black hair and wearing Black glasses, and I have a gray beard with some gray in it. I'm wearing a teal shirt with a Black jacket, and I'm sitting in front of a white wall with the diploma on it. I do apologize that there's a bit of a glare. Hopefully that will disappear soon as the day continues on, but that's a visual description of me. I am pleased to serve as Executive Director of the WITH Foundation. The WITH Foundation was established in 2002, and we are a foundation that promotes comprehensive healthcare for adults with developmental disabilities. So we look at supporting comprehensive service delivery models for adults with developmental disabilities. We also look at supporting cultural competency training and cultural humility training for medical professionals that are providing services to adults with intellectual and developmental disabilities. We look at supporting programming that increases the understanding and use of supported decision-making within healthcare settings, as well as in general looking at supporting things that ultimately help adults with developmental disabilities achieve access to high quality healthcare. Ultimately, the foundation benefits from the lived experience of people with disabilities in all aspects of our operations, including within our board of directors, within our leadership, and we benefit from the use of a self-advocate advisory committee. So I like to say that we're not only working to promote comprehensive healthcare for people with disabilities, but we're working to promote it with people with disabilities. So I'm making sure that the work we support is done in partnership with the disability community. So I'm so pleased to be a part of this conversation and get to spend a little bit more time with you, Sandy and Bridget. Y'all are both so amazing, and this is going to be a very good and important conversation today.
Thank you both. And Ryan, please soak up that ray of glare for us East Coast folks. Yeah. So to start, it's been a hot minute since I started in this role, right? It's, I think, really less than 4 months. And I know I talked a lot about how people with disabilities as philanthropists is not really a new idea in that framing. And that being said, disabled people who look like us, who are disabled people of color in the philanthropic sector and are part of organizations that hold influence, that is still pretty new. And so my question to you both is, how does leadership of Black disabled people and disabled people of color in the sector inform your organization's work, and the ways that you approach funding to push back against that legacy of telethons, whether it's Ryan, in public health or in pop culture and media representation for you, Bridget? Who wants to start off?
Yeah, sure. The Pop Culture Collaborative has always been like a BIPOC-led and centered organization. We were founded by a group of primarily BIPOC women and queer folks who, had a very direct personal experience of the harm that narratives and stories can have on our communities, right? So there was, in the context of a philanthropic sector that was actually very wary of art and culture and cultural strategy, these funders, many of whom were not artists at all, but working on criminal justice or immigration, gender justice, they just had an instinct that was kind of like deep in their belly instinct that this work was absolutely critical to the broader sort of work of building movements and building power in pursuit of social justice. And so they brought that intention into the design of the Pop Culture Collaborative, and they had a great deal of intentionality in terms of bringing a Black, queer, disabled woman into this space of leadership within the organization. And I think when we started kind of conceptualizing this organization, myself and my colleague, Tracy Van Slyke, who is our Chief Strategy Officer, we were the first two staff members in the organization. And we started asking questions, much like you're doing, Sandy, and talking to BIPOC artists in the entertainment industry and movement leaders, cultural strategists, researchers, and really sort of saying, well, what do you think? What are the levers of change here around like a narrative immersion and the kind of dominance of really harmful and toxic narratives about our people? And across the board, when we asked people to lay out their vision of what change looked like, it was never about representation. It was never about like, how do we have more people in the room? Where our kind of prospective grantees, because at the time we were so new, we didn't have grantees, where they all went, it was just such a consistent message was, how do we build a new room? How can you help us to actually self-design the spaces that we work in, the processes that we use to create art, the mechanisms by which we connect with our audiences? They wanted to be agents of change in kind of breaking apart the industry, the pop culture industries, and remaking them, reshaping them in ways that really like genuinely centered the innovation of their communities. And so we this question of like, okay, if it's not representation, it's not like inclusion is also a terminology that sat a little hard with people in our community. And it certainly did for me, because as somebody who grew up in spaces, going to colleges at predominantly white institutions, there is so much that's really painful about being included in spaces that were not created for you. Or with you in mind, and maybe even didn't allow you entry at some point. There's pain in that. And so I started to ask another question, which is what lies beyond inclusion. It's not representation, and inclusion is complicated. What lies beyond inclusion? And it was actually at the point when I began to actively seek out BIPOC disabled people and asking this question, that's kind of like my imagination really started to crack open. So I had a conversation with choreographer Alice Shepard, and I said, what lies beyond inclusion? And she said immediately, innovation. And That was sitting in my brain. And then sometime later, I was at a convening that we were hosting in Los Angeles, and with a lot of people in our community across all of these different entertainment and movement sectors. And I was speaking with Lawrence Carter Long, and I shared this kind of like beyond inclusion is innovation. And together we were sort of riffing on that. And he said, if access is being able to physically get into a party, and inclusion is about being intentionally invited to the party, then innovation is when you're the one throwing the party and maybe even reinventing how a party gets thrown. And that was really, that was when all of these conversations that we'd been having with people in our community who are saying, you know, we want to throw our own party. We want to tell the stories in the ways that we want to tell them. We want to create those stories in the spaces and with the people and with the technology and methodologies that we have designed. We want to draw upon the wisdom, the creativity, the ingenuity, the joy, the inclination towards joy that is so inherent in our communities. And we want that to be the lifeblood of our creative space. How can you help us to do that? And so that's what we've really designed the collaborative strategy to do, is to really not reinforce. We rarely fund projects that are about reinforcing the industry or even the movement spaces that currently exist. We fund towards the infrastructure that will be a platform for our community to reimagine space and to center themselves and their power and their communities in those spaces, in our case, in the spaces of really generating new stories and narratives. And so what that looks like is a community that's, for instance, reimagining television writers' room processes, right? Where we are breaking down the walls of these rooms that historically have been very closed, inaccessible spaces for all sorts of people who've been systematically excluded from the American story. We see grantees who are proposing ideas for how to democratize those spaces, to bust down those walls and really create stories in radically different ways. It looks like projects that are like a research project that we funded, where there was a grantee who recognized that the ways that Hollywood traditionally tracks audience engagement with stories absolutely invisibilized the ways that different communities, BIPOC communities, disabled communities, engage with content, right? We use different platforms, we use different methodologies through which to even experience content and to talk about it, right? And so they designed a research program that was looking at how to create an audience measurement system that visibilizes all of this activity that's happening in these alternative spaces that can directly affect and does directly affect how much money, how many resources are actually directed at projects that are developed by people within our communities. So we've really tried to lean into, as experimental a realm of grant making as we can, to take the lead from members of our community, and to push the bounds, to like introduce new ideas, to sort of support people to introduce new ideas, ways of thinking, technologies, creative processes, and the resulting stories into the pop culture landscape. And what I'll also just add is that process is also married to an internal process that's happening concurrently within our organization, which is the process of really asking on a deeply personal level the role that disability and disability innovation has played, is playing, will play in the shape, the culture, the workplace of our organization, of the Pop Culture Collaborative. That has been a question that I, as a disabled leader who did not grow up with the identity of a disabled person, although I have lived with disability my whole life, there is this process of looking backwards and remembering myself differently, to understand the role that disability has played in my identity, in the choices I've made, in the directions I've taken, in the ingenuity that I've expressed in my career as an artist and as a culture change strategist and as a funder, and beginning to channel that new awareness into the design and redesign of our organization. And the reality is that there are many, 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 many more people in my organization and in our field who, like me, have lived with disability and expressed disability innovation without ever calling it as such or recognizing it as such. And so we have work to do to kind of like journey from personal to professional to public, so that all of that experience and reflection is integrated and becomes kind of a heartbeat within our field.
Thank you for that. I do want to add just a few things to what Bridgit said. I think from my perspective and Wiz's perspective, when I think about the benefits to us being intentional and having a disability justice approach and making sure to include the perspectives of BIPOC people with disabilities, first and foremost, I want to acknowledge that every organization, including WITH and myself, we're all on a journey when it comes to disability justice. And when you look to the pioneers of disability justice, Sins Invalid, they note that the framework is evolving, but it does specifically uplift the leadership of people of color with disabilities and queer, gender non-conforming individuals. But other than that, it is something that's evolving. It's a living, breathing framework. So I think we're all on a journey of learning more about disability justice, more about our own experiences. So with and myself, we're constantly learning and evolving. There are ways in which our self-advocate advisory committee challenged me and helped me expand my understanding of our work and how we can do our work. And, I myself am a person with disabilities, but there are ways in which, kind of having that multiple perspectives can help us all evolve and continue to challenge ourselves to do more, to do better, to really allow for access for all and really, benefit for the broadest aspects of the communities and identities that we all have. I would say from Wiz's perspective, it also helps us gain a stronger understanding of what disability looks like through the lifespan. Sandy spoke about the history of telethons. I think from my perspective and kind of when we think about disability in the general public, so often they care about us when we're kids, but then when we become adults, we become invisible or just objects of pity. And I think, disability justice and kind of by including diverse perspectives, it allows for a stronger understanding of what disability looks like through the lifespan and how, people with disabilities are leaders and experts in their lives and in Wiz's perspective and in the care they receive, the healthcare they receive. So I think that's a very valuable aspect. It may seem simple, but it's, it's just something that's needed to be a part of the conversation. I also find it helpful to point out when you look at the data around disability, although when you look at representation of disability, you may perceive that disability is a quote unquote white issue. The data shows that 1 in 4 Black Americans has a disability. And when you crunch all the data, it is in fact Black women that most deal with disability. So I think by being intentional and including the perspectives of BIPOC people with disabilities, it helps bring these issues to the forefront and continue to help support us in evolving and challenging us all and how we're funding and making sure that we're really supporting the communities in its own solutions instead of imposing solutions or beliefs onto the broader disability community.
Yeah, thank you both for what you shared and offered. This is exactly why I was so thrilled that you were open to being discussion with me, because it's just almost like just so much fun, and I'm always learning from both of you. And I would also, although I didn't ever get a chance to know him, I'm not sure that Paul Longmore ever foresaw or like predicted a future where the three of us are having this conversation right now. So that being said, legacy work is generational work, right? And both of you have likely been at countless tables and part of many conversations having to do with moving the needle on things. And I think all of us now have just an infinite collection of these needles. How do you, have the patience for these changes or those moments that feel like there are days when it's just about holding the boulder on that very steep hill, right? Like I mentioned that between the 1950s to 2016, it was like $2 billion have been raised through telethons. And when I think about what changes this sector rise to that legacy, and I might be speaking out of pocket right now, and I'm going to own it again, but I imagine what would a $2 billion response from this sector look like? And so, yeah, just to put that question to you, and when you do find yourselves in those moments and at those tables, you're talking about inclusion, and Bridgit, you mentioned that it wasn't like that didn't even sit with you initially. Like, what are the ways that or the framing or the perspectives that help you to show up in those conversations when it's like, okay, here we go again?
I mean, I think I will concur that philanthropy is genuinely like a rough sector to work in, and particularly as BIPOC people, as disabled people, as women, as queer people, it is somewhat unforgiving of a space, because the layers of power and kind of power, of wealth hoarding, of using power to define and really constrain, what change can look like and what direction movements can go in is actually is so palpable inside of the space. And I think for myself, the thing that I'm coming to realize in the last 5 years of being in this particular position is how really, really fortunate I've been over the course of my career, and particularly in my time in working in movements, to be working in these kind of like what I didn't realize were terribly, or beautifully, I should say, insular spaces, working closely with mostly BIPOC women, women more broadly, queer, transgender people, as my, I was a consultant before I moved into this role. And so my clients and my colleagues and friends, I operated in that kind of a bubble where some of those kind of standards of how we, of what we're trying to get done, and like who we are and how we relate to each other, how we hold ourselves accountable to each other, were just on firmer ground. And in philanthropy, I find myself sometimes moving into rooms where I am back to being like the only something, and I'm navigating power in ways that I find like profoundly uncomfortable. And so what I have come to do, the thing that has been sort of my way of weathering those kind of periods of discomfort, is to always constantly restore and circle back and reground in that community that I know can hold me and can see me, that loves me, that helps me, like creates pathways to joy, Sandy, as you were talking earlier. And so for me, that is, we have a staff that's really incredible. I restore back into my staff constantly. Our grantee community is pretty exceptional. And one of the ways that I have lived into joy and leaned into it in my leadership at the collaborative is that it has always been, since the very beginning, the art of gathering that we have embraced is one that centers love and relationship and care. And so we have this community that, like, when we get together, it could be for a convening to talk about like narrative systems or some kind of theory or whatever, but people are so happy to see each other, and they greet each other, and they connect, and they like ground in how they're doing, and they bring love into space. And that is something that many people in our community will note about how we gather. So I restore inside of our gathering spaces, and we put a lot of energy and a lot of resources into our gathering space. And so that's one of the ways that I sort of constantly reground. And I actually think it's worth noting, it's really fascinating in following this, that when you think about where power is moving, where you are seeing more BIPOC people, more disabled people in leadership and philanthropy, is in the context of donor collaboratives. Actually, it's a space where those communities are ascending and bringing really different methodologies and ways of working into the philanthropic space. And so more and more, I am also restoring into community with other leaders of donor collaboratives, right? Like that is where I'm beginning to feel kinship and support and recognition. Like, I see what you're doing here, I am doing it too. We are navigating similar space, and that's power, right? Like that is a source of power and of healing, actually. And so those are the ways that I am staying grounded and whole inside of a field that I think is actually a sector that actually is still fairly hard on folks like us.
I want to thank Bridgit for sharing that. I think from my perspective, and I think in all ways we can all speak to this. I think as people of color with disabilities, that there's a familiarity with the unknown. When I think about my own life, there's nothing in my life when it started that would have told me that one day I'm going to run a foundation. Even when I started my journey in philanthropy, and would occasionally quietly say to myself, one day I'd like to run a foundation. I had no clue how to do that. Like, I had the desire, but there wasn't really a path. It was, a journey into the unknown. And I think so much of what we're all working on in disability is a little of we're operating in the unknown space. But I think it's important, and what restores me is that we're all capable of creating ripples of change. That for me, I've never been the type of person that can walk into a room and have everyone look and pay attention to what I say. And for the people that can do that, that is awesome. That is a skill that is incredible. But to me, it's also intimidating. But what I can do is, if groups of people or a few people come to me and say, here's our goal, what do you think? How can I accomplish? I can help, my community, a few people, get access to resources, get access to information. So I tend to think, through my way and through all of our work, we're all creating ripples and change, whether it's, speaking to billion-dollar foundation executives or helping that young person with a disability learn that, hey, you should consider a career in philanthropy. Those are ripples of change. All are important. I also think it's important to continue to elevate the fact that we all have different identities and we all have different experiences. And as much as I can continue to say, here's what my life experience is, but here are experiences that you're not hearing, or here are other individuals that aren't at this table. As much as we can be intentional in making sure that we are increasing the size of the tables that we sit at or gain access to, or at the very least, raising the issues that aren't being discussed at the table, that too creates ripples of change. So I take comfort in the fact that, it is ripples that in fact change the world. It is ripples that will in fact change the philanthropic sector. It is ripples that have brought me this far in my life, and it is ripples that will carry us all further. So I do take some comfort in that.
Yes, thank you both. And noticing the time, and I do want to perhaps try to get to at least one audience question. I'm sorry, I knew this was going to happen. I'm not great at time. But yeah, Emily, please help us.
You bet, Sandy. It's hard to imagine that this is going to end because I personally could listen to this for a lot longer. So I regret that we didn't go 2 hours, 3 hours. Lots of great questions. We'll make sure to share them with all the panelists later in case you want to answer on your social media, since we're not going to get to all of them. Someone asked, how are funders sharing power with grantees, and how are they allowing criticism from grantees and practicing self-criticism? Anybody want to answer that? And Sandy, feel free to be an answer or two and not just moderator.
So I will say from my perspective and with Foundation, I think that there are always, through your application processes and through WIS application processes, we ask, how difficult was this application? What issues did you experience? So start by, from the applicant level, ask what issues their experiences and be open to that feedback and incorporate the feedback and try to improve your processes so that your application processes are accessible to the broadest possible audience. And then by including the community in your decision-making, it helps hold our feet to the fire. I'm very familiar with having uncomfortable conversations through our self-advocacy advisory committee, through our board, and sometimes with our grantees. So get comfortable with having uncomfortable conversations and make it clear that you are a partner, that this is, you are equal, that this is a safe space, that you benefit from hearing the frank, unvarnished truth from them and they you. So get comfortable with the uncomfortable and have those conversations. And then again, as we are all emphasizing here, have the community in decision-making positions. That is the first and foremost way to kind of share power. Have them in those seats of power. Have them in the decision-making positions. Have them in the rooms of power.
Another question was, as an aging, retired, disabled woman, how can I support this area most effectively? How do I give my assets to keep us moving? And I imagine we've got to make time for that question because that's great.
I think you should answer that question, Sandy.
See. Well, I think that going back to the idea that I was talking about earlier, that disabled people are already philanthropists, I think I'm always happy and open and want to keep our meetings and to have more meetings with our community members. That's actually my preference. This is to have more conversations with communities. Because that's in a way, both getting back to what Ryan was saying earlier about, accountability. Supporting us is, keeping those lines of communication open and making sure that we as folks who are in the sector continue to demystify it in the ways that we know philanthropy can be. And I'm still working on that demystifying process 4 months into this, right? So I think that's one of the ways that I would recommend.
I think another way, one of the things that I think is about demystifying how resources move to different sectors and communities is just sort of unraveling what like a donor collaborative is, right? And how it really does in many ways, it expands the community of people who can come together and pool their abundance to resource change makers. And so, Sandy, your fund and others are opportunities too for people to be in community with other donors that are building power together by aligning around vision and strategy and supporting people like Sandy and others to move resources into the field with great thought and care.
Thanks. Well, we have a minute left, and just want to thank Bridgit and Ryan again so much for your time and generosity, and this conversation has been awesome. I know that it won't be the last one that we'll have together, and and to our audience and CRIP community, just sending each and every one of you so much love and safety and solidarity in this time. So, thanks. Over to Emily.
We're going to pass it over to Kathy, actually. Thank you all.
Hey, everybody. Thanks so much for coming. This is awesome. In the spirit of true philanthropy, I will, and fundraising, I'll put out a plug for the LongmoreInstitute on Disability, and Emily will share a link in the chat if you loved this program and want to see more like it, where we elevate voices of people with disabilities in new and exciting ways. Please do so. Also, when we send out publicity for the program in general, we'll get feedback from you, but we'll also send out contact info for the organizations that are represented here today so that we all lift each other up. And it's awesome what's going on. And thank you for a wonderful, wonderful program. And I really appreciate everybody's time and everybody coming. And together we're going to lift the world up and make it better and resort to something other than telethons to raise money. So thank you very much, everybody.